welcome to the Caspian Podcast, the podcast of the Caspian Post, with me, Mark Elliott. Welcome to the Caspian Podcast, the podcast of the Caspian Post, with me, Mark Elliott. Today, I'm delighted to be talking to my old friend Tom Marsden. Tom is was the editor of Visions magazine, a truly marvelous magazine, which sadly is no more, and is now working on Experience Azerbaijan, put together by the Tourist Office of Azerbaijan. And on top of it all, he's also doing podcasts. So doubtless you may be hearing me on his podcast as much as you're hearing him on mine. So anyway, Tom, very much welcome. You came to Azerbaijan, what was it, 7 years ago?
Yes. Well, thanks very much, Mark, for having me on your podcast. So I've been in Azerbaijan for about 7 years now. I came in 2014 from London.
And how long did it take you to go from? I know you came as for working for a tutoring agency, but how long did it take you to move into the journalism field?
Well, I worked for a tutoring agency for about 9 months actually. I confess to effectively when I came to Azerbaijan, I had this idea that I wanted to explore the country, to write about it, and to do some photography, that kind of thing. And I found Visions magazine in the office or nearby the office I was working in, and I looked at the address on the magazine, and I subsequently went to the address and made some connections with the editorial staff, and then the editor was leaving. And I applied for the job, and I got a job there, and that kind of took me off in a completely different direction in Azerbaijan.
Well, and for those who've never seen this magazine, it really was quite unusual in that it tried to give a real balanced idea of culture, history, and at a time that trying to be even-handed was quite difficult because, there was a lot of propaganda in the air. How did you manage to steer an even path? I mean, there must have been pressures on you.
Yeah, I mean, Mark, that's a really good question because, yes, on the one hand, obviously you're promoting the country, so you have to be, the whole idea of the magazine was to promote the country, but in a very kind of balanced way really it was sort of focusing on the culture, cuisine, focusing on the stuff that's sort of non-political, really trying to steer into the cultural field and travel as well, because there really is so much fantastic stuff in Azerbaijan. There are stories everywhere. Yourself, having written your guidebook for decades, that you'll go off for a weekend and end up in a beautiful mountain village somewhere, and soon enough people will be recounting their local legends and tales and this kind of thing. So really, when we were making the magazine, it was trying to focus on the stories that sort of give Azerbaijan colour and character.
But I know you also have a very good eye for stories that people may not otherwise have noticed. I remember the time that you took me to see some strange looking mud hole on the edge of Baku where people were bathing. But you turned that into something really interesting. Where can people find that? Did that make it into the magazine?
That did make it into the magazine eventually. So that was a very odd place just outside Baku, which in summer it becomes very popular. It's basically a salt lake, which people go there and they bathe in the salt lake and then they cover themselves in mud, and obviously this is thought to have magical kind of healing powers. So you're quite right. We travelled there together one day and had a real adventure. And I think we ended up in someone's apartment in somewhere in the Baku suburbs, having what's it called, the local made
the tutovka, the mulberry hooch. But the visual image is something very striking, is it? Because people are plastered with black mud. But another thing that I've really enjoyed in your own work, I think you even had an exhibition of it with taking pictures of old Soviet cars in strange locations.
Yes,
how's that
absolutely.
Project been going?
Well, yeah, that's something I began very soon after I arrived in Azerbaijan. I'm a very keen photographer, as a hobby. So I spend a lot of my free time kind of pursuing personal projects and traveling to various parts of the country and even other countries as well, trying to piece things together and kind of make an interesting story. And the Soviet cars, I mean, that's just something I noticed very soon after I came to Azerbaijan, that there was just this extraordinary abundance of old Soviet cars. And I've lived in Russia and I've traveled to loads of countries in the region, Georgia, Kazakhstan. But for some reason in Azerbaijan, there's just more, more of these old Lada Zhigulis and all the various Soviet cars than anywhere else I found. It's kind of a curious, a very quirky thing. And when they were sort of blending into these extraordinary mountain landscapes and mud volcanoes and the sort of all the diversity of Azerbaijani geography, it made for quite a sort of interesting project. Which,
I think this is something that people in the region find hard to understand. Is people, perhaps older people from the West, finding such interest in anything linked to the old Soviet system. I know just to find an old Lenin statue, or astonishingly, there's even a Stalin statue which I discovered still standing in a very remote kolkhoz, what used to be a Soviet collective farm. I shan't even say where it is because I don't want to make it too easy for people to go and demolish it. But it's it is extraordinary what you can still find, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely, and you're completely right about the sort of Soviet aspect. And obviously, for local people, the Soviet Union has a sort of negative, a very negative connotation. And in promoting Azerbaijan, people don't really want you to promote the sort of Soviet heritage. Whereas from the West, that's what we find one of the major things we find fascinating. So again, in my job with the magazine, promoting the country and its culture and travel, trying to find that balance between how local people want their country to be promoted and how sort of a Westerner finds it interesting. It's a very difficult balance to make.
I think, yeah. Yeah, I think that is changing a little bit, perhaps. I noticed that a very popular thing for the tourists now in Baku is that Soviet experience restaurant where people are dressed up in army costumes and pretending to be rude to the customers in a slightly jovial mockery of the whole thing. But yeah, now tell us, Tom, you've done so many articles over the years. What would you say was the most exciting of the projects that you took part in for those magazines?
Oh, well, that's again a very difficult question. To be honest, Mark, as editor of these magazines, I try to there aren't that many people writing about Azerbaijan. So when I'm trying to source material, I try and let people like yourself just write about what you're passionate in, and then try and fill in the gaps to try and balance out the magazine. So often I'm writing about things that I'm not sort of fully interested in, but it's sort of just plugging holes. But of course, there have been articles which have been really fascinating. I mean, just recently, I've written an article for the Experience Azerbaijan magazine about how European bison are being reintroduced into the country, into a specific area of the country, into the Shahdag National Park. So there are many countries in Europe which are reintroducing the European bison. And I believe even in the UK, that's going to happen next year or in the next couple of years. But Azerbaijan is one of them. And sort of historically, the European bison was roaming the Caucasus Mountains. And over the last couple of years, they've been trying to re-establish a small herd, which hopefully will grow to about 500 bison over the next sort of 25 years and become a sort of iconic species of the Caucasus Mountains, which in turn will attract tourism, which will in turn help to conserve the species. So it's a really fascinating little story, and that allowed me to travel out to the Caucasus Mountains with someone from the WWF, and sort of this is one of the great things about my experiences in Azerbaijan, working for magazines, is that I've had, these people are so hospitable here that if you want to interview someone, or if you're researching something and you just contact someone, they're so willing to help and to take you to places and show you what's happening.
And I know you're a Russian speaker. As the years have gone by, so fewer and fewer people speak Russian. Are you still finding that it's possible to communicate in Russian, or are you brushing up on your Azerbaijani these days?
Well, yes, I have been learning some Azerbaijani. Admittedly, my Azerbaijani is just shocking. I mean, it's it's a sort of level that I start, trying to speak to someone, and they just very quickly cut me off and speak English, which is another thing in Baku, is that young people, they speak very good English. So in Baku, with the younger generation, I would generally speak English, yeah. But with the older generation that grew up in the Soviet time, they still speak very well. Some people will speak Russian as a native language, and if they don't speak it as a native language, they speak it very well as a second language. So it depends really who I'm talking to, but generally with a sort of younger crowd, it's English, and with an older crowd, it's Russian. And
it's true, isn't it, that these days for a tourist visiting Azerbaijan, if you're sticking to the main centres, and Baku, Sheki, perhaps, you're likely to do all right in English, whereas even a few years ago, that would have been pretty tricky. Now, just going back to the thing about some of the work you've done in nature and so forth, I think one you might remind us about is the time with the leopard man down in the Hirkan forest. Just to tell people, the Hirkan forest is right on the southernmost border with Iran, and I know Tom went there because I've been down and I've met the same guy. Quite an extraordinary fellow, isn't he? Do you remember his name?
Yes, Babahan.
Babahan, that's right. Yeah.
Locally famous in that sort of southern Lankaran and Astara region, and he featured in there was a National Geographic documentary about the saving the Caucasian leopard, because it's extraordinarily rare and endangered. And in this sort of Talish Mountains, Hirkan forest area, this sort of southernmost point of Azerbaijan, I think there's only about probably about a dozen of them left. So they're desperately trying to conserve it. And you've met Babahan as well. He's so he is sort of he's known as the leopard man because he grew up in this forest where the leopards live, and he sort of studied their behavior over the years. And
it was wasn't he, that it wasn't him that actually showed the cameramen from the National Geographic where to put their camera traps?
Yeah, absolutely. So he can track the leopards. He can follow the paw prints and figure out which way they've gone. But it all started for him when he was actually attacked by a leopard, didn't it?
Yes.
I think the story is that he was returning from his military service to the Hirkan forest, and a leopard had killed one of his sheep, and so he went off in pursuit of the leopard to hunt it, to kill it, and I think they were sort of waiting outside its den for several days for it to appear, and it didn't appear. And as they were sort of retreating down the mountain, suddenly out of nowhere the leopard appeared and attacked him, and they sort of went tumbling down the mountain together. And funny enough, after that moment, his perception of the leopard completely changed, and he began to see it as this, beautiful, powerful creature that was just trying to defend its territory. So these sort of local stories in Azerbaijan are one of the highlights, really.
Yes, and what amazes me is the fact that someone as marvelous as that chap will actually act as a guide for little tourists like myself who want to see. And obviously, for people visiting, you don't get to see a leopard. I mean, the chances are minimal. Even after a year's camera traps, it was only seen through the traps rather than in person. But that area is just gorgeous. I mean, those moss-covered forests are absolutely extraordinary. And again, as you say, these are great experiences. Now, Tom, we're going to get short of time in a moment, but I just have to ask you: could you just tell me what is that statue or statuette you have beside you? Is that Stalin or something? What are we looking at? And it's not Lenin, is it?
Not Lenin. It's actually Steve Jobs. The story behind this is, again, this relates to an article that I was writing for, I think it was the Experience Azerbaijan magazine. I was interviewing a guy who had basically built a statue like this in the town of Gabala.
Hang on, a statue of Steve Jobs in Gabala.
Absolutely. So if you go to the Gabala region in Azerbaijan, a very beautiful region in just beneath the Caucasus Mountains, as you enter the region, there is a big statue of Steve Jobs, and you can purchase one of these souvenir mini statues. So after the interview, people being very hospitable, they often will treat you to tea or whatever. But very unexpectedly, I was given a small statue of Steve Jobs. Which is
but what's the connection with Steve Jobs and Gabala? Is there any connection, or is this entire? I mean, there's got to be a story there.
I think the connection, if I remember correctly, is that Gabala is kind of known for its apples, for its apple orchards, and so that the Steve Jobs connection between the company Apple and apples and Gabala. That's not the only bizarre statue in this particular part of Gabala. There's also a statue of Jean-Claude Van Damme, because the village where these statues are located is called Van Damme. There's absolutely no connection between Jean-Claude Van Damme and the village Van Damme, but this local guy has very cleverly seen that for tourists it could be interesting.
Well, honestly, and I think this is, as my own experience of having written guidebooks about Azerbaijan, there are wonderful, quirky things all over the place. I mean, have you been to Khachmas, where they have gigantic clothes pegs and the three wise men and all? There are endless things. But anyway, I'd just like to thank you very much, Tom. I hope we'll be able to talk many more times on these podcasts, but thank you for joining us today. You've been listening to the Caspian podcast with me, Mark Elliott, and Tom Marsden. Thanks very much for joining us, and I hope to see you again next time.